You're listening to Let's Talk Sustainable Business.
Hello, my name is Uwe Schulte, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to our podcast series, Let's Talk Sustainable Business. The series is brought to you by the Conference Board. Today, I will be talking to Jacob Sterling, Senior Director and Head of Ocean Decarbonisation and Innovation at Maersk. Please let me now introduce our guest for today. Jacob joined Maersk in 2009, having worked prior as a conservation director at the World Wildlife Fund. He has held several positions in AP Moller-Maersk, and he has a master in biology. Welcome, Jacob. Please tell us a bit about yourself and how sustainability has entered your professional life.
Thank you, and thanks for the invitation. I think that sustainability entered my life fairly early on. When I think back, actually, I can recall that when I was around 13 years old, I wrote a piece in Danish classes in Denmark, of course, and used that as a reader's letter for the local newspaper, which actually got brought in the newspaper around that time. So I think that is, I don't know if that's where it started, but that's my earliest record of having that interest. That led naturally to studying biology, where I very much focused on biodiversity conservation. Spent quite some time on Borneo, and then that led naturally to WWF, where I was in 7 years, and then at some point during that period, I thought, it could be really interesting to work for a big corporate and see if you could help them change in a more sustainable direction.
Now, you made me curious. What was this letter to the editor about?
It was about environmental issues, and I can't recall it word for word, but it was something around that we should be better at cleaning up for ourselves, and we shouldn't leave waste in nature and things like that. So a bit more down to earth than the topics that we talk about today. But yeah, just about we cannot use nature as a trash can, and we should behave better as human beings.
I'm really impressed because boys entering puberty probably normally have other things on their mind, but amazing.
True.
Great. Look, our audience will at some point in time have seen a container going around somewhere on the streets with a Maersk logo on. But Maersk is a bit more. Can you describe Maersk a little bit to our audience?
Sure. So Maersk have been in business for over 100 years, and our core business have always been shipping in various shapes and form. In recent years, we have decided to focus very much on container shipping and also integrated logistics. So whereas if you go back 5-10 years, it was the norm that we would typically transport containers from port to port. Now, to a much greater extent, we take care of the full transportation of our customers' goods from end to end. So from where it's produced at a factory or wherever to a distribution center, or maybe even to a store or where it's going to be consumed.
But it normally involves a container somewhere in the middle.
It certainly does, because it has shown since the 50s to be a very, very practical and very efficient way of storing and transporting goods long distances. And I think the invention of the container is probably the single most important invention to bring down the cost of global trade. So yes, it usually involves a container.
Yeah, Maersk is a really truly multinational company, and that makes it interesting to hear that you, coming from WWF, joining a company like that. Was that a big shock to your system?
To be honest, I expected it to be a bigger shock than it turned out to be. I can't really explain why, but I mean, it was, or maybe it was just the group that I entered in Maersk, but I think that the mindset of wanting to make positive change was very much the same as where I came from. The big difference was that there was a lot shorter from taking a decision to action in Maersk than when working in WWF for obvious reasons, because as an NGO, you decide on what do you want to focus on in terms of changing the world, basically, and then you go out and try to convince others to actually help do that through lobby work or projects or other means. Whereas in an organization like Maersk, if we decide to do something, most of the time we can just decide to do it, and that just makes a huge difference. And I felt that was very empowering and very motivating.
You know, when I talk to people in the non-governmental organizations, um, for some, multinational companies are the enemy. So for them, you've changed sides. But what I hear you say, it doesn't feel for you like that. Could you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, and I understand where they're coming from, because there are examples of big companies that are, doing less than what you would think they could do. But I certainly don't think that there's an antagonistic relationship, or should be, between NGOs and companies, because I would say, as I also mentioned before, companies actually have the ability to act. Um, and we as corporates can take inspiration, and we still do, from NGOs, who are very often much more at the forefront of the, you could say, of the thinking in this space, and therefore can give a lot of important insights on what's going on, and what are the trends, and what are maybe the topics that we haven't really thought about so much yet in big corporations, where we maybe tend to focus more on certain big topics like climate change, for example, and then go really deep on that. So I think there can be a healthy tension between NGOs and corporates, and there can certainly also be a super valuable collaboration.
I think you're making a very important point. I just said that on the NGO side, they see, some of them see multinationals as the enemy, but it's the other way around very often as well, and that hinders, of course, communication and actually joint progress. So I think what you just said is important, that when you are in a large company, it is worth your while, even if it's difficult, to try to communicate with at least some of the NGOs.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, you've already mentioned how important containers are, and it is very clear that containerization of ship freight was a huge efficiency booster after the Second World War. But today, there is now a concern about the environmental impact, and it would be nice if you tell us a little bit about how you are in Maersk approaching the sustainability, all the sustainability challenges that are connected with your business.
Sure. Yeah, shipping is a big and of course multinational by nature industry that has significant impacts, positive and negative, around the world. On the positive side, as we talked about, we enable trade, and we actually make it possible for very remote parts of the world to trade quite efficiently with the rest of the world. So those are some of the positive impacts. On the negative side, of course, I know we're going to talk more about climate change later, but that is just the one really big issue, because we use fossil fuels, and because of the size of the industry, it really has a huge impact, 2 to 3% of global CO2 emissions. But as Maersk, and as I think also others in the industry, we are also looking, of course, at other issues that are not related to climate change, such as anti-corruption, which used to be, or corruption or facilitation payment has notoriously in the past been something that the industry was facing and had big problems with, and we are beginning to be able to actually do something seriously about that. And also things like responsible procurement, human rights. The broad sustainability agenda is, of course, important for shipping. But I mean, when we look at our impacts and try to assess the materiality, it is really our use of fossil fuels that is the biggest challenge to us and to the societies that we serve. A company like Maersk, we alone the fuel that we use, which is around 11 million tons of fuel per year, um, emits 0.1% of the global CO2 emissions. So while we are at times being portrayed as an environmental leader for some of the steps that we are taking to do something about that, it's just important to bear in mind that this is a beginning of the journey, and we are not there yet. There's so much more to do, and as I said, shipping as a total is around 2 to 3% of global CO2 emissions. So massive impact, massive responsibility that we need to take on us.
Now, of course, this is the key point. But before we enter the discussion about greenhouse gas, there is another one that always comes up when we talk about uh, shipping vessels, and especially container vessels. These, I'm living close to Hamburg, and I can see them going up and down the Elbe River, and it's quite amazing. And the industry has been challenged. The shipping industry is challenged about malpractices on scrapping retired vessels. Can you say something about that?
Yes, I mean it is rightly, as you said, also an issue for the industry that the practices around ship recycling or ship scrapping, however you turn it, are not always up to the standards that they should be. At Maersk, we have for the last, I think, more than 5 years invested in upgrading facilities in India to the standards of the Hong Kong Convention, which is the regulation, the international regulation in this space, to make sure that it's done in a proper way. Because, of course, when we operate ships for their entire lifetime, then it's also our responsibility to make sure that they are dismantled in the right way. And by the way, that the materials from the ship recycling is also used in a good way, because effectively steel that is being reused is much more sustainable than steel that is being made directly from iron ore. So there's a lot around ship recycling, both from the social impacts, as you mentioned, where we need to make sure that the workers involved in this can do this in a proper way where it's safe for them, but also the environmental impacts, both on the direct pollution in the areas that should be prevented, but also the resource use around ship recycling, making sure that the steel is recycled and reused to the extent at all possible.
I recall that a couple of years ago, I saw a project mentioned that you're trying to start at the design phase of new vessels to make them more easily recycled. Is that correct?
Yes. When we did the Triple E ships some years back, we had a project where we looked into how we could potentially design and also map the materials that are used to build a ship, so that when you get to the recycling phase, you can both recycle it better because you know what materials are where, so to say, but also actually get a higher price for the ship when you send it for recycling, because you can document the value of the ship that you bring to recycling better. I think, I mean, that project is still, you can say, something we are working on finding our way to do, because it's actually really hard to do as one company alone. But the whole issue around steel use in container shipping, and we use a lot of steel both to build ships, to build containers, to build cranes in the terminals and so forth. Steel is a big issue, and it's an issue around circularity, where we need to make sure that we, to the extent possible, really design, use, and reuse the steel in the smartest possible way.
And I guess that you have to do also jointly with steel manufacturers to form collaborations there.
Exactly. I mean, we need to do jointly with the shipbuilding industry, with the steel manufacturers, and the whole value chain. I mean, and when you look at the ship in Hamburg, you would think that, wow, when you build ships like that size, you must be really important for the steel industry. But fact of the matter is that we're quite small. So we actually also need to link up with a lot of other industries that use a lot of steel, because it's only when we all join forces that we can make the case for turning towards green steel in a bigger way.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. But I must say I'm encouraged. There is there is now a large-scale pilot plant for hydrogen-based steel in Sweden, and I know that other steel manufacturers are working on at least starting with gray hydrogen. That's already a starting point. Yeah,
Yes.
no,
Yes.
that's great, and I'm glad that you mentioned the human rights issues around
Mm.
the recycling of ships there, because we have seen horrific pictures
Mhm.
of children working there and what have you. But even if there's no child labor involved,
Mm.
uh, work safety wasn't considered,
Yes. Yes.
and I understand that you guys are really taking the Hong Kong agreement serious.
Yes. Yes. We believe that the facilities we use are, and we have external verification of that they are up to the Hong Kong standards.
No, that is admirable, and obviously there is progress, but I think we all agree that the industry still has a long way to go there. And and let's come back to what you've already talked about. That of course, one thing we always say when we have discussions with companies, what is the key point? Where is your
Mm.
big impact?
Mm.
On the sustainability agenda, and it's no use of ticking the box of 17 United Nations Sustainable
Mm.
Development Goals. It's important that you do something about where you really matter,
Mm.
and as you said, you really matter on carbon footprint. So can you talk a little bit about what your ambition is there?
Sure. We set our first net zero target in 2018 actually, and back then it was a result of a thought process where we said, okay, we need to go much more ambitious on climate change, and we could also see that this setting a net zero target would be the only right thing to do. So we set a net zero target where we said we wanted to go to zero in 2050 for our shipping operation. And then we actually, after that, started looking into how do we actually do that, because up until that point, we had primarily focused our efforts on climate change, on energy efficiency. So basically making the ships more efficient, using less fuel when moving the cargo. But we could see that this would not help us reduce our absolute carbon footprint, because while we were becoming more and more efficient, we were also growing. So we could see that even though we became much more efficient, and we were around 40% more efficient compared to our baseline, then our absolute emissions was more or less the same. So we could see that this is an issue of changing fuels. So we started looking into that, and we investigated that for a couple of years and actually came to the conclusion that it was realistic for us, not easy, but realistic and achievable if we went all in to go for net zero in 2040. So earlier this year we cut 10 years of our deadline, and when we did that, we also expanded the scope to not only cover our ocean business, our shipping business, but actually to cover the entire business, including all the scopes, scope 1, 2, and 3. So both our own direct emissions, which are the biggest because that's the fuel we burn, but also the electricity consumption and the whole supply chain of our business. So that's our scope and that's our ambition now.
That, um, I think it's interesting to understand how that process internally
Mm.
worked. Yeah,
Mm.
so um, you know, I remember the days when at Maersk, you offered customers a journey, let's say to and from China, going more slowly.
Mm.
And that way consuming a lot less fuel per ton of cargo
Mm.
delivered, but you would lose 2 or 3 days
Mm.
in the journey, and see whether um, people would accept that. Um, but that, of course, is, yeah, it's nice, but it can't be the solution, and you already mentioned
Mm.
that.
Mm.
So, what made the change inside uh, Maersk to go from this approach to a much
Mm.
more radical approach? I
Mm.
mean, we'll talk about a little bit more going from 2050 to 2040, but the main point is, um, that for a company like yours to say we can actually do net zero,
mm,
um, that is an amazing step and needs a lot of visionary risk taking
mm,
from some senior executives. How
mm.
how did that happen?
Yes, it's a good question, and something that I also actually reflect on quite a lot. I think that to really understand what makes company do something like that, put upon themselves a voluntary target in that magnitude, I think it's probably need to look at company culture. And Maersk is a company that's been in business for more than 100 years, and it's our clearly stated ambition to also be around for the next 100 years. We're a family-owned company, which also enables us long-term thinking in a way that is probably different from some others. And then we've always had a tradition for really innovating in the space of energy efficiency, trying to see how much can we really squeeze the energy efficiency, either by going slower or designing better ships or installing new gadgets on the ship, whatever it might be. We've always looked into that a lot. So it's in our blood, if you will, to push the boundaries on that. But you're right, it's a massive shift to go from that to actually set a net zero target. But back in 2018, what led up to it was really um, an understanding that, or we could see that both among our customers, our investors, our employees, and society by and large, that this climate change was becoming a really important topic, and that so I think that the net zero target was really about this is something we must do, and it was probably the first time where we set an environmental target where we didn't really know the pathway yet. So we also knew that we were taking a lot of risk, but we also felt that it's only if you jump into the deep end, so to say, that you find your way. We cannot stay on the safe side and just set targets that we know we can achieve. We need to lean in here. But I think it's also a realization that so on one hand side it's about something we must do, it's an obligation, but also that we can see that expectations are changing rapidly in the society around us, and if we want to continue to facilitate a model where goods are produced in one end of the world where it's more efficient to do so and consumed in some other way end of the world, and that is connected by global trade where we are a very important part. If that model should be for that model to continue to be socially acceptable, basically, we would have to decarbonize trade. We would have to decarbonize the way global trade works, globalization works, basically. So I think I don't know if that answers your question fully, but I think those are some of the thoughts that went into it.
I think you made a number of important points that I noted for myself. A very important one said family-owned,
Mm,
long-term thinking,
mm,
and what I'm hearing you say, and correct me if I'm wrong, but basically you're saying if we want to stay in that business, if we don't
mm,
want this to be shut down because it's causing too much um, carbon, we have to take another type of risk
mm,
uh, to develop something which we're not quite sure what it's going to be, but we know what our ambition
mm.
is.
Yes. And we basically get to a point where we say, it's a much bigger risk if we don't act. We might take wrong decisions and it might cost us money to move into this space. But if we don't do it, we are at much greater risk as a company. And that changes the conversation.
That does change the conversation. That is a very important point you're making here. And you see, for me, it's interesting. I have again and again the discussion when people make these carbon commitments.
Mm,
Um, what we notice is that a lot of people have made net zero commitments without even knowing how to get there. That is fine, as we see with you, but then you have to sit down and actually
Mm,
define the steps.
mm,
And that is something you and I should explore a little bit more when we discuss what you're going to do. Let's we're running a little bit out of time, but I think we have a few minutes to at least give a vision of how you will actually achieve that. Because the challenge
mm,
is, of course, if you make a net zero commitment and have no clue and
mm,
then let things go by, then it's greenwashing.
mm.
I
Yes,
hope you're not greenwashing.
I certainly hope so as well, and I know we're not. No, you're right. I mean, you can set a target, and you can be bold, and you can lean out, but when you have set a target, then you're also obliged to then follow it up with a fairly specific roadmap, and for all of your emission categories, figure out how are we actually going to do it. So that was our next steps, and it was building those roadmaps that actually led to cutting 10 years of the deadline, because we say, hey, if I mean, if we truly believe this is a climate emergency, we should act accordingly, and we should push ourselves to the max.
Now, I want to work to a cliffhanger for our next
Yes,
episode, of course,
of course.
when we're going to talk about how you exactly do that. But let's do a little of bit of a spoiler, because I was very impressed that you guys made an announcement to lay down new ships. Can you just explain what you've done there, and then we'll explore um, why you did this and how?
Yeah, I mean, what we did 1.5 years ago was basically to say that from now on we would only build ships that can run on green fuels, and we did that, ordering the first vessel of its kind, running on green methanol, without actually knowing where to get the fuels from. And I think that's probably the cliffhanger you were looking for, because yeah, at least we felt that was a moment of pushing the boundaries a lot, and now we're a little bit further into the action. But it's yeah, that is the big challenge. How do you develop an industry from scratch, or with that, for green fuels and shipping, basically?
So that the 15 more questions around that, but let's just summarize what you've just said, because it's quite crucial. What I hear you say is Maersk has decided um, that you will run increasingly your vessels with a fuel that is green,
Hmm.
and we'll find out in the next episode what that fuel is, where it comes from, and what you're going to do. But I have to say, um, I'm seeing here something, and that's I think worth pointing out, is uh, you are just part of a large industry.
Hmm.
You're one of the big players, but there are other big players as well, and at least one of them might argue that they're bigger than you are, but that doesn't matter. There are 4 or 5 big players, and you didn't wait for them to do this. You've decided to go ahead.
Hmm.
That is a risky step,
Hmm.
but it is what I would call a sustainable leader step. Um, I'm normally not praising companies easily, but I think praise is worth what it's worth. So thank you for giving us this insight on how this has developed in your company. I think that's important for the audience to hear, and we will go in more details in the next episode. So thank
Looking
you,
forward to.
Jacob.
Well, thank you, and yeah, looking forward to talk more on the details. And it's nice to get praise, but it's also we need to deliver. That's really what matters. The planet is doesn't care about promises. It's only when we deliver it matters.
True enough. But for our audience, if you've enjoyed this episode, please remember to subscribe to our podcast series or explore the entire catalog of podcast programming from the Conference Board by visiting our website at tcb.org/podcasts. Thank you for listening, and please join us again when we continue the conversation with Jacob. For today, goodbye.
That was Let's Talk Sustainable Business.